All right. Welcome, everyone. Everybody is joining and rolling in all at once here. I'm going to let all of that get sorted. My name is Brittany Higginbotham. I'm Communications and Digital Specialist for the Institute for Public Relations. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on the 4th Annual Disinformation in Society Report. I only have a few announcements and then we'll kick it over to Tina to get this started. One, we will be recording this and it will be available for playback within 48 hours on our website and YouTube channel. Please feel free to use the chat and Q&A for all your questions and comments throughout the webinar. We'll have a moment at the end for Q&A. And if you have any technical difficulties, please just message me and I will help you through them. And with that, I'll pass it over to Tina.
Hello, everybody. Hope you're all having a great day. I'm really excited to be talking to you today about disinformation in society, along with my wonderful co-presenter, Dave Scholz. Wave, Dave, wave. Dave is one of our great IPR trustees, and he splits his time between Canada and the US. We've also done a study with Leger, where Dave works. He's the chief strategy officer, and we've done a study on disinformation in Canada. And then this is the first one we partnered with Leger in the US. Dave has been our trustee for several years, Dave, and he's also the director of our Behavioral Insights Research Center, which we will talk about today. Leger does some really cool research, so I suggest you check them out. So before we get started, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about the data and go through the data that we found in our latest survey. And then we're going to talk about ways that organizations can actively combat disinformation. I think this is particularly relevant this year because we're in an election, presidential election year. And as we've seen in the past election and the election before that, that disinformation has been slowly increasing term after term, and it will only get worse from here. So without further ado, here we go. Dave?
All right, thanks, Tina. So just a quick talk on the methodology. This is an online survey. We did it with 2,002 Americans, representative from across the country. And this is fielded in the summer. So obviously there's been more disinformation since then, but that people may have focused or wanted to talk about, but it was a good focus and similar to work that was done 2 years earlier by the Institute of Public Relations in the US as well. Quick methodological note, we talked to everyone. We described misinformation as false information that is spread regardless of whether there is an intent to mislead, and disinformation was defined in the survey as deliberately misleading or biased information. So when people were asked questions, it was very clear what we were talking about. So they weren't putting their own definition to it. Tina?
Okay, so to Dave's point about the disinformation and misinformation, when we asked this question, we gave specific definitions, those definitions that Dave just gave, because there is inconsistency about what the actual definition is. We also avoid using the term fake news because that also creates confusion because there's not a consistent definition for that. Sometimes it's used as information we don't like. Sometimes it's actually used as disinformation. One of the reasons why we wanted to do this study and why this was really important to us is because of what we saw. One, our trustees wanted us to look at disinformation, but also of the impact that it has on society and organizations. And you just saw yesterday that tweet from the Securities and Exchange Commission about Bitcoin and how that impacted stock price. And so those are the things that we really care about because we see companies who've been damaged, like millions of dollars in reputations, such as Pfizer. So that's why we are very concerned with this for our organizations. So what we did to kick off the survey is we asked people about the top 15 major issues in the US in 2023, because we wanted to get an idea of where disinformation and misinformation fall, but also in relation to other issues. So we didn't want to say, how big of a deal is misinformation to you without putting it in context of other sort of issues. So when you see, just to give you sort of an indication of what the graph looks like, when you see the arrows that are green or red with the up or the down, that stands for percentage points. So when you have like healthcare cost at 72%, and it has -4 pp. What that means is that last year when we ran the study, that number was 76%. So we just take 76% minus 72%, which is percentage points versus a percentage decrease. So that's when you see the percentage points, and you'll see that throughout the graphs through this. And then all of these made an appearance in our last study, except for inflation. That was new this year, and that was the one that bubbled to the top. Historically, when we ask about the major issues in the US, can people tell us whether it's a major problem, minor problem, or not a problem? Healthcare costs is typically at the top, along with the economy. So this year when we ran the study, we saw misinformation in the news actually saw a decrease of 8 percentage points. Both disinformation and misinformation last year were at 69%. So it'll be interesting to see where we are with this year when we do it with the election coming up. Now, note that there's a lot of things that aren't on here, but we did record those. We have climate change, we have discrimination, but disinformation and misinformation to the general audience was a bigger issue to people than the other pieces that fell off the top 15.
And when you talk to people about, can you go to the next slide, Tina? When we asked people about disinformation, does it undermine our election process? Is it a threat to democracy, increasing polarization, infringing on human rights? Universally, Americans feel that this is true. And this is regardless of a party and focus in terms of who you would likely vote for. This is what you believe. But the interesting thing is, what you think is disinformation tends to be different depending on your political stripe and what you like. So I'm going to go back to a year ago. Tina mentioned that we did this study in Canada. One of the questions we asked in that study, we gave people information around masks and the COVID virus, and do masks either prevent COVID from being spread, or masks don't prevent. And we asked people, is this news misinformation? And falling down regional and political voting stripes, people tended to think disinformation was different. So what may be true for Tina is disinformation for me. What may be true for me is disinformation for Tina. So it's interesting. Overall, people are saying it's undermining our election process. They just think it's necessarily different information that's coming into play.
Brittany and Sarah, if we have any questions, can you just stop? I can't see the chat, so if you all can just, that would be awesome. Thanks.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. So one of the points that Dave made is really critical, is that when we looked at the different demographic factors, which we collected a whole slew of demographics, it was the political affiliation that rose, that was the biggest differentiator, which is why throughout you'll see the deck that we'll do separate Democrats and Republicans quite a bit, because that was the biggest factor. But when you see the numbers that are pretty high, like when you have 3/4 of people that say disinformation undermines our election process, it means that both political parties felt strongly that that is true. So just note that when we're going along the way, when you see those numbers high, it means that the two groups come together. Okay, so then we ask questions. Most of these are questions that well, a couple of these were questions we asked last year, but we have a couple new ones. So when you see that asterisk next to it, we have added those this year. Now, when we also ask questions about artificial intelligence, and the majority of responses, if you see in that top middle column, that more than half did agree that artificial intelligence will create more disinformation in society. We also asked about how commonplace it was, and 3/4 of Americans did say that it was commonplace in society. And we also wanted to think about the mental health impact of disinformation. And it does make people feel anxious or stressed, but a little less so than last year. But one of the interesting pieces that I just want to note is that when you look at that top one, the I have knowingly shared disinformation, that 14% of respondents, or 1 in 10, have said they have knowingly shared disinformation. And if you remember from our definition, disinformation means that it's an intent to mislead. So that is really interesting. And 16% really weren't sure whether they have knowingly shared it or not. So just wanted to point out, because that's always a very interesting finding to me.
Yeah, and 14% have shared it. If you go to the next slide, who do we trust when it comes to news sources? Number 1 is our family. Number 2 is people like me. Number 3 is our friends. So if we have people in our friends or family circuit that are knowingly sharing disinformation, And these are the people that I trust. It means that there's a greater likelihood that it's going to spread further and further and further along. Now, you'll see that there's a little less trust of family, friends, and people like me this year than the year before, but it is still the top three. The positive light to all of this is the fact that local broadcast news is at 63%. It's in the top five for who we really trust when it comes to getting news from different people.
Okay. All right. So this is also what I was talking about, where we see the gaps and why it's very important with a lot of these studies to run those differences to see what differences do occur between the different demographics. So as you can see here, if you think about it, if we ask questions like, what is your to what degree do you trust NBC News? If we just aggregated that in average, it would be pretty good for NBC News. But when you look at it from differences between Republicans and Democrats, you can see the difference between sources. That nearly between 8 to 9 out of 10 Democrats do trust NBC News as a source, but only 1/3 of Republicans. That's why it's really important to think about what sources, that even though we as individuals may trust certain sources, maybe people on the other side of the political aisle don't. And so you can see that for a lot of these, there is a huge gap in trust. Except for, I wouldn't even say except, but the Wall Street Journal is a little closer, but it's still a pretty good sized gap. And then you can see mainstream media is clearly more trusted than Democrats, except when you go to Fox News, and clearly that Republicans have more trust in that source than others.
All right, I'm just going to
myself in here because I hear that people are having a hard time hearing me. So hopefully this is better. And I'm going to answer a couple of questions. Tina, can you go back one slide just very quickly? Where you where you see the asterisk. So for example, US military has an asterisk next to that. We asked this question in the past. We did not ask US military or have it on the list for people to rate as a trustworthy source at that time. So that's why we don't have a percentage point comparison between it. We don't have data to compare it to. And it was asked, why only NBC News? Well, if you go to the next slide, Tina, the one you were just on, you'll see that it wasn't only NBC News. It's just NBC News is the one that scores at that 56th percentile, higher than the other ones in place there. We actually asked, as you can see, for a variety of news sources across the map. And when you consolidate that down into local broadcast and local newspapers, if you go to the next slide, Tina.
Wait, hold on. Sorry. There we go.
That's okay. Perfect. This is where Tina talks about high scores are really reflective of whether you're Democratic or Republican leaning. So local broadcast news trusted some or a lot by 77% of Democrats, 57% of Americans. Overall, as I mentioned earlier, it's at 63%. Local newspapers is trusted fairly high at 58%. And again, consistently, higher for both, but more higher for Democrats, but generally higher than a lot of the other sources that we talked about. Tina, I think you wanted to talk a little bit about news deserts here as well.
Yeah, and just to point out, this is why for us, before I get into the news deserts, this is why it's really important when you see studies that ask about people's perception of media. What is your perception of social media? You really have to break it down because none of the sources are created equally. So for example, NBC News has very different perception than PBS News as mainstream media sources. Same thing with social media. Facebook is not the same as LinkedIn, which is not the same as TikTok, which is not the same as Instagram, which is why in this study, we ask each individual source. It's kind of like the same thing if you say my employer versus major companies versus nonprofits, like organizations are all different. So that's why we differentiate here. Now, this is consistent over time. It was consistent the same way in Canada as well, is that where both political parties come together a little more than other sources is with local news. So here you have local broadcast news, like 77% of Democrats, but also 57% of Republicans. And very, very similar to the local newspapers. But what we have seen in the past, since 2005, Dr. Penelope Abernathy has been doing a study. She's at UNC Hussman School of Media, She also did a stint at Northwestern, but she does a study on looking at news deserts. And what that basically means is where local newspapers have closed entirely or even switched to weekly. So since 2005, we've seen 1/4 of our local newspapers close. And there's also issues with consolidation, companies buying up local newspapers and sort of tearing them down or making them partisan. We've also seen that as well. But the local newspapers is really where communicators can come together and help. I think, how are we with questions so far, Brittany, Sarah? Any other questions we missed? Or
We're getting quite a few questions, but I don't know if you want to save them for the Q&A.
Okay, so I can see some of them. So did you offer the respondents the chance to identify themselves as independents as opposed to Dems and Repubs? Do you want to answer that question, Dave? Because I know how we used to do it, but I know we do independents, Democrats, and Republicans.
We do, but that is how we asked it, but we do kind of push people to choose where they're most likely to vote or where they've previously voted. So, and we're just highlighting the extremes here that have come through. And people asked about, did we collect other demographic information? And the answer is yes. And Sarah has put a copy of the report up for you to download. You can download the full report. Where things stand out significantly different amongst a demographic group, we've talked about it. But in general, the largest difference comes between Democratic and Republican groups.
Okay.
One of the questions, Tina, is what might be the motivation for deliberately sharing disinformation? I thought that was an interesting question. I mean, 14% of people have said that they deliberately share misinformation, and there's some speculation about why people might be saying this. Is it a case of they did and now they're answering us that yes, I did it, but knowingly share it is different than finding out later that I shared?
Yeah, I can give you a few research-driven examples of where that comes in. I mean, one of the things with disinformation is it's typically something that creates emotion or invokes anger in you, because that's why you're going to share it, because there's something that, you know, just in your mind is not right. So you have to tell people about it. I mean, there's multiple reasons why people share, is to make sure that people hear their viewpoint, even if it's incorrect. It can also be financial motivation, that if you want people to click on your site, so that way it gets more traction and more ad revenue. So that's one. There was also a really interesting study that NYU did in the psychology department. Jay Van Bavel did a study, and Ani Sternisko is one of his doc students. And what he found is that a lot of people who may share conspiracy theories and disinformation have one of the personality factors is national narcissism. So what that basically means is that it's not that you're narcissistic, it's that you have such a great love for your country or political party that you're willing, to share disinformation that fits that viewpoint. And that is something they looked at all these demographic factors, and that was the one. So you would rather share disinformation to protect your country looking bad or whoever you're for, because that is more important than your personal reputation. So I can also, when we follow up, I can send that. That is a really great research study. It was about COVID. And they've also done some other studies that look at certain personality traits which make people share disinformation. So there's all sorts of reasons, even though you may do it knowing it's disinformation. Sometimes you saw what happened with the last election with like the Russian government. They have their own sort of agenda. So I think thinking about what is the agenda behind why people share disinformation, there's a lot of different answers there.
Yeah.
Is this you, Dave?
No, this is you. Just keep going.
Here we go.
You're doing so good.
All right. So then we asked the sources that people believe are most responsible for spreading disinformation to the public. And we're also, so what we did in this section is we asked which sources are most responsible for sharing disinformation to the public. But then we also asked, and you'll see this because Dave will cover it, which sources are responsible for combating disinformation and also how well they're doing. So as you can see here, and this is to my point earlier of why it's very important to separate the different types of social media, is that Facebook, and you see Chinese government, Russian government are up there pretty high with, they are the ones very responsible for spreading disinformation. And of course, it's politicians, not from your political party, but the other team, which is also what we see in a lot of research And then what is also I want to point your attention to, everyone, is 61% of respondents said public relations professionals are very responsible. 61% said major companies and corporations are very responsible. Marketers and advertisers, 64%. And with that, I know that other research in our field has said that businesses are the most trusted sources, and we have not found that. We didn't find that last year. It's not something we consistently find. And we do ask about major companies, my employer, and we are not finding businesses to be trusted institutions compared to more like personal networks. Dave?
Yeah, just one coin of this. When Tina was talking about national narcissism, I think you referred to it as, the politicians not from my political party are very responsible for spreading disinformation at 68%. So again, information that doesn't align with my parties or my views is considered disinformation, even though it might be true. And I see some people asking about how do people differentiate between what is the truth or disinformation. A lot of times it doesn't come down to whether it's the truth or not. It's that perception of belief, and that perception of belief leads to what they share or don't share as they're concerned about it. And when you next slide, please. And when you bring it down to just sort of collapsing all of this information into some buckets, ultimately it's social media platforms that have collectively a large part of the responsibility. And I don't think this is a surprise to everyone. A large part of the responsibility for spreading disinformation. Facebook, TikTok, X being the top three ones that we see. The next grouping that comes in is, as Tina pointed out, public relations professionals, marketers and advertisers, major companies. So there is that concern of whatever is being said, whether I agree or disagree with it. If I disagree, I'm seeing that as disinformation that's being spread. And then the last group of who's spreading it is media sources, and journalists lead the way. So someone asked in the chat about it's interesting how Republicans are more likely to trust local news, but then when you say, do you trust CBS? The answer is no. So when you start naming, and a lot of that comes from not trusting journalists. They're leading the pack in terms of these groups.
I always think it's so interesting, Dave, because I feel like I grew up in a smaller town in the South, and I always feel, and I just went home, and the same broadcasters when I was growing up like 40 years ago are still, I think they just freeze them. They're the same people who are still there. So I think when you ask people, do you trust Sue Strawn? Like, of course the community trusts her. So I think the whole term journalist has received such a negative connotation.
Yeah, well, that gets back to the relationships that media have built with their local community. So if it's a friend or family member, how you view it, because you see them every night on the 6 o'clock news, you're more likely to trust them going forward with that. So consistency of small town reporting is really what you're saying, is what people are coming across.
Absolutely. And one source that's missing from here, because it didn't rank high enough to say that they're somewhat responsible, is me, not me, Tina, but me, just people in general. So we did add that question this year, like, how much are you responsible for sharing disinformation? And I think that gap that people don't really feel like they're very responsible for sharing disinformation is also why changing how we share information can be very challenging.
Definitely.
Okay. So here's who's responsible for combating disinformation, and consistently the government and journalism. So you see at the top, we have when Donald Trump was president, he was also very responsible at the very top as well, along with the government. The Supreme Court used to also be at the very top, but they've decreased them. But as you can see, it's different news sources, journalists, newspapers, cable news, and that's pretty much who the majority is.
And then in terms of who should be combating disinformation, the number one source is I'm the one that's best at combating disinformation, or people like me. But third on the list, and this gets back to what we've been saying all along, is local broadcast news. So again, a trustworthy news source is also who I believe is doing at least somewhat well at combating disinformation and giving me the real piece of information. And that's consistently tied with fact-checking websites in there and just above local newspapers, which gets back to that local source. But again, I'm scared that I'm sharing disinformation. 14% of people have knowingly shared disinformation. The people that I trust to get news are people like me, and the people that I think that are combating it are me or people like me. It's a soup pot of bad things that could happen as we go forward in terms of people not being prepared to handle disinformation. And we're going to see a lot more of it this year.
Just to get through just a couple of questions, I can do it pretty fast.
Sure.
One question was about whether disinformation differs considerably from conspiracy theory. When I was talking about the Jay Van Babel report, some conspiracy theories are actually true. So it doesn't mean that conspiracy theories are exactly disinformation, and it doesn't mean the reverse. But some conspiracy theories that we saw with like Pizzagate are disinformation that we see. The percentage of respondents identified as Democrats or Republicans, Dave can correct me if I'm wrong, but they mirror what the population size is. Is that correct, Dave?
They do, based on general polling or voting and how people voted last election. It's consistent.
And then could it be that personalized ways of accessing news in today are responsible for both dis and misinformation? Absolutely. I mean, now I don't want to say her name, but Alexa, she's been misbehaving this afternoon, but every time I say her name, she plays a story. But we're talking about the Amazon device. And she'll even say, because I ask her to play the news in the morning, she'll even say, if you would like to skip a story, or if you would like to, right? So I get to be the driver of what news I see. And we see a lot of the social media platforms also dictate what shows up in your feed. And TikTok too. I do watch TikTok videos. And I can curate my own stream. If you spend too long on a video, sometimes I like watching parrots talk, that all of a sudden I get all parrots talking. So it definitely caters to your needs, but it's not necessarily information that I need to know. So that's where the gap is for sure. Okay, so this is really interesting. So this is very important to pay attention to. And this is the gap between what Dave just talked about in terms of who should be responsible for combating disinformation, and in terms of how well people perceive they were actually doing it. So when you look at the US government, you just saw these stats, 62% said they should be very responsible for combating, but only 35% saying they are doing so at least somewhat well. And you see these gaps with government, you see the gaps with some media, politicians, but where those gaps are closer, where people actually perceive outlets doing a good job is, again, that local broadcast news and newspapers coming through, as well as fact-checking websites. So that's a really interesting point to note that, and you know what, when we ask this question of who should be responsible, basically every source, people responded that they should be responsible. But we also have to take ownership and be responsible for helping to combat it as well.
Yeah. And so this is where we're looking at from who do we trust, who's combating it, who's delivering it, but how prevalent is it is one of the things we wanted to understand. Now, recognizing that people don't necessarily identify what is disinformation or misinformation all the time, we did ask, how often do you come across news or information that you believe misrepresents reality or is false? And 40% of people said they see it every day or almost every day. Over 2/3 of respondents reported coming across false news or information at least once a week, and 40% of Americans saying they're seeing false news almost every day. So they're identifying it significantly. This actually seems low based on when I open up my web browser and the news headlines and the things that I read, but people are still identifying that they're seeing it. And this is why it would have come in our top 15 list of things that people most are concerned about. They're seeing it and they're represented as an issue.
Okay, so then this is another great question we asked was, okay, so do you go to other sources or websites to verify the information that you're seeing is true and accurate? And as you can see, that a lot of people said they actually do go to other sources to verify that it's true. That's around the 64% range. So that's pretty high, 2/3. And then we asked people about their level of confidence in being able to identify basically or misinformation. And people are pretty much in the, I'm somewhat confident. And I think this will only increase as we see deep fakes and other things that pop up with the election, and AI as well, with generative AI and how you can generate images or other sort of information as well. I mean, 18% admitted that they were not at all confident about disinformation.
And I'm going to answer a couple of questions that have come up very quickly. Tina, there's a discussion. I agree. Someone mentioned, do we start early? Do we talk to youth information and disinformation literacy in schools, in the post-secondary or the secondary school systems where people are taught how to read news? I think that would be fantastic. Tina, do you know of any programs that are on right now? I mean, I know there's a few, but not prevalent from what I understand.
Yeah, I think it depends on the school districts and the curriculum. So I know that, like, I live in the Seattle Public School District. My kids, I have 3 kids, they go to the Seattle Public School District, and there is like news literacy curriculum. I think it was also New Jersey that has some news literacy curriculum as well. But there are some great resources that do offer training programs, like the News Literacy Project, that do like teach people how to be news literate. And there's also different terms for this. Some of it's called media literacy. Some is called like news literacy. Others that we see more is called information literacy. And it basically says how people can like fact check the information that they read, which is actually correct. And that's where family and friends come in so much, is because those are our trusted sources. These are people that we live with and trust, which is why, it's important that that circle where people are getting their information and trust the information also is providing accurate information.
And a couple of the people that are watching are from Canada, and they've asked, did we look at Canadian viewers? We did last year. So last year we did this same study in Canada. People are welcome to go to the Institute for Public Relations website. It's available on there. It's available on the Leger website if you want to go take a look there. And yes, slightly less polarizing in the US, but still Canadians are well on the path to these level of results. The percentage points aren't much far off. The one interesting thing is, instead of local news was still important, but CBC was still respected across the country. Whereas PBS here, to draw a parallel to a government broadcasting system, had a little bit lower scores than CBC would have had in Canada. Tina just talked about whether people are checking information and how confident they are in their own ability. For a lot of people, though, and if you can go to the next slide, Tina, they're not checking. They're just avoiding watching news in general. I can't trust. I don't know what I'm reading or seeing. It's all false. So I'm just getting 40% of people said they have avoided watching news. And a third of Americans are looking outside the US to media for their news sources because it is seen as necessarily more trustworthy, or they're able to get more information coming out of it. So it's something that people they have a concern about, they're focused on, they'd like to not be confronted with it. So I'm either not going to read or I'm going to look elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to shout out, I saw Michael Charenson I just pulled up the chat, is providing resources. Michael does some really great work around, shout out Michael, does some really great work around disinformation and work with PRSA on disinformation. He's actually presented, IPR did a masterclass in disinformation last year, and Michael was one of our great presenters. So awesome.
And then where do we go from here? Tina, I'm going to let you talk about the paths forward. Please, no disinformation or misinformation on what we can do from here.
I'm going to do. All right. So there's a lot of things that organizations can do as communicators and what we need to think about. No one is immune to disinformation. In fact, one of my colleagues who works in disinformation also fell victim to disinformation during COVID and shared some resources that were not true. And she admits it. And that's sort of her shtick, is disinformation. So it happens to all of us, but I think it's also a matter of making sure that if we mess up, to correct it and acknowledge that we mess up. But I think it's also making sure that the information that we share is true. You'll see people sharing like the Onion articles or other things as truth. So there we go. But organizations they can contract with nonprofits like the News Literacy Project, First Draft, which was independent, but then Brown University wrapped them in. There are some really great sources out there, or you could build your own. My perspective is that disinformation is clearly a big issue. We're going to see it at the forefront of the work that we do this year, especially with a very pivotal election coming up. And we as organizations should be offering training to our employees to make sure that they understand how to read information. And you know what? It benefits us as well quite a bit. Like, we get a lot of benefit if our employees become better consumers. And research shows that people who do take information literacy classes or do that sort of thing, that it improves resiliency, decision-making, problem-solving. So there's a lot of great benefits as well. The other thing is making sure you can be a resource for people. So for example, when COVID was happening, your organization doesn't have to take a political stance, but you can be a resource of where people can go for more information. Where can people go to get information about the legitimacy of the election? Like, what are the trusted sources? For example, in Seattle, we had, and this wasn't just in Seattle, but we had issues with people giving like false polling locations or misleading people as to where polling locations are. And by polling locations, and we have only mail-in ballots, but it's like where you can drop off and what you can do. So those are like, where is the trusted resource? One of my good friends, I'm not going to call her out, but she sent like our group chat a message asking about, like, I heard that the new COVID vaccine doesn't cover the old variants. And I was like, well, I'm not a medical professional, but I would go to the CDC and sort of find out, because that's more of a reputable source. So I think it's identifying those reputable sources and making sure you provide it. But it also is how the organization becomes a trusted source, that you're transparent, that your employees trust you because the information you give that's not related to disinformation, but on a day-to-day basis, is a trusted source. One is funding local media, helping support local journalism. That's really critically important. There's a lot of great resources to support local journalism. There's also bills, typically in either state or federal, like Congress, that's passing to support local journalism. We just funded a project here in Seattle for our papers. There's and also fund research. Like the reason why we're able to do this sort of project is from partners like Dave, who say, you know what, I would love to work with you. That's really important for our industry. So let's partner together and do a study. And that really helps us as well. I would tell everyone they should also develop a crisis plan for, if you don't already have one, specifically for disinformation. How do you react? How do you respond? One of our trustees at IPR, her name is Lisa Kaplan. She's at a company called Alethea, and they are a company focused on disinformation. So they're looking at disinformation, constantly monitoring and predicting disinformation in certain organizations, sectors, industry, country, what crops up, and then offers suggestions for how you can, what you can do about it. Another suggestion is to become familiar with behavioral science. Dave is the director of our Behavioral Insights Research Center, and there's a really good understanding of human behavior. How do people behave? How do they think? What sort of biases do they have? So, for example, there's theories like inoculation theory, or where you can inoculate against disinformation. So if you know you have a particularly like voting, like where to vote, if you know that that's going to be an issue coming up at the election, then you could preempt it and tell people, you are going to hear, and people will tell you and try to distract you from where to vote, but here's exactly what you need to do. And that typically inoculates that from disinformation. You see a lot of that research in climate change. The other thing is a lot of media and tech companies are responsible for the disinformation that's on their social platform. So it's making them accountable. A lot of organizations that you may all work for are funding disinformation. When you buy like ad packages, some of that shows up on sites for disinformation. We saw that see it all the time, but especially during COVID, where you actually had some of the vaccine manufacturers who were on and advertising on anti-vax sites. So it's very important to look at who you're supporting and what you're supporting, but seeing where your advertising is. And we're also, I think Brittany is going to pop some, she may already have done that, some sources in the chat that IPR has. We are also under Dave's leadership of our Behavioral Insights Research Center, and shout out to all the trustees who are part of that work, that we are going to put together a guide for disinformation, especially in this election year. And we're happy to talk to anybody at any time about our study. Well, not at any time, but at designated time about the study and the work that we do to try to combat disinformation.
You know, Tina, one of the questions was, what do we do as PR professionals and companies who are seen as spreading misinformation or disinformation? How do we regain some of that trust? And I think when you talk about, making sure you're transparent and sharing information that is positive, make sure what you share is checkable, make sure what you share can be followed up on. Those are all things that can help get to that point. And staying away, exactly what Tina said about staying away from websites that are spreading. Don't get associated. Don't be friends with the disinformation people, and be on their sites as little as possible.
And we saw we saw even what happened with Claudine Gay last week, and a lot of that is spread from disinformation. I was going to say something really great, and I completely blanked. Dave, go.
That's all right. And I think it is a chance for our profession to, Elizabeth Hurst made a comment, should we be taking a public standard training through schools about spotting this? This is the chance for our profession to stand up and recognize and say, yes, this is how you recognize disinformation. This is how you recognize what is truthful and trustworthy communications. We should always be doing that as public relations professionals.
Yeah, and so what I do remember I was going to say along those lines.
I was just talking on and on until you figured it out.
For me is I see Sam Stark is on here. Hi, Sam. She's one of our trustees. She's the director of our Digital Media Research Center, and we're doing work on AI. So that's a great example, right? And Dr. Casey Myers, he's a professor at Virginia Tech. We published an article of his about disclosing AI. That's a great example, right? Then the article was like to disclose or not disclose, but it was really about why we should disclose if we're using AI, because what we'll see is that if we're not going to disclose, like this was generated by AI, this was created by AI, and we make it seem as if we created it, that's where we also get into whether we are a trusted source of information. So for example, we have this generative AI study coming out. We're in the final edits. And I took the whole report that I wrote and I put it into ChatGPT and said, write a 2-paragraph introduction. And then I heavily edited it. But I included a footnote at the bottom of that page that said exactly what I did, that I entered the report into ChatGPT and asked it to produce a 2-paragraph intro that was then edited by me. And I think that disclosure goes a long way, because what we've seen is that when people don't, then that's problematic. I just saw a question pop up that was about whether we over-exaggerate our ability to spot disinformation. So absolutely. There's a great theory called third-person effect, and it typically applies to the media. And what it is, it's a theory that says, you know what, people are so influenced by the media, but not me. It happens to people, everybody else, but not me. Like people have a hard time detecting misinformation, but not me. And we see that time and time again in studies. So we absolutely do see that, and not even just in this area, but but in other areas as well, that people are more confident. They always like it. People think they're better drivers than people around them. That's actually research. That's not Tina's opinion. So it's a theory. It's been like retested typically in the media, but it absolutely does track a lot of times. And then you have this demand effect, and what we call like the social desirability factor is that people don't want to say, I share this information or I don't check my sources. So sometimes they will answer in a way that is more positive for the researcher than negative. So
yeah, and I think we saw that in terms of people saying that they've shared, well, only 14% are saying they've shared something that could be disinformation. It's probably much higher than that. And that's the concerning factor to that. Tina, in the Q&A section, we have 3 questions. So someone asked about exaggeration. Is that the same as disinformation? I mean, if you're saying something that is not true and you're saying it for a specific reason, which is to spread false information or take that exaggeration and make more people believe it, then yes, it could be disinformation. If you're simply adding a very, it's important, well, now it's very important, you're exaggerating it, maybe you're doing it in a way that's more misinformation, but you're not intending to change opinions. It really comes down to intent. And then this question about the federal judge limiting federal government contact with social media operators. Did you see that one? Someone said the decision on hold is the Supreme Court has agreed to hear a case on the federal judge limiting federal government contact with social media operators. Do we think the original decision will help combat disinformation or make it more prevalent?
I mean, until you hold the social media platforms accountable for what they said, it's the same thing with the Telecoms Act, right? That it's the same thing, that if you let internet providers off the hook for what is on the sites, like the social media platforms, then yes, I mean, you will, but if you were held accountable for what you put on those sites, then it would make a big difference in combating. And I'll also say I don't want to get too much in the weeds of misinformation versus disinformation, because if you can, it's all just sort of false information, and whether or not people can discern that it's false information and what they do with that information. Because we know, and MIT did a study, that false information spreads 6 times faster than factual information, because it is, like I said, it also not only just emotion, but it's also designed to evoke hatred. It's designed to invoke polarization. So absolutely. And there are different types of misinformation. I mean, you could say that the onion is misinformation. There's a lot of different types, and there's a great chart that First Draft has that says, here are the different types of misinformation. It's hyperbole, if it's exaggeration. But then on the other hand, it's whether people actually can discern whether it's actually real or not real.
Yeah, that's the big part of it.
There's a lot of commentary.
There's a lot of commentaries. People have asked, are we sharing the chat when we share the presentation? And Sarah and Brittany are both nodding their heads. So the answer is yes. You'll be able to, there's a lot of links in here, a lot of valuable links for people who want to go through afterwards.
Yeah, these are really great. And then it'd be great. Shout out to Sarah and Brittany, our comms team. They're always so on it, and they're the best. But we can also put it on the Burke site, all these great links and resources as well, so people can get. Yes. Oh, it's interesting. Mark Klein. Hi, Mark Klein. Mark Klein's one of our great trustees as well. And he said that when you're doing something else, like listening to a podcast while doing the dishes, I assume Mark is listening to this while he's doing the dishes. That's just my assumption. That you are more likely to believe what you hear and less to be able to tell it's true, because multitasking. Fascinating. This is great. Yes. Oh, I love, these are such great resources. This is great. I'm trying to see. Brittany and Sarah, I've just lost track of it all. Is there anything that we missed or something we should say?
Trying to go through the questions, just because, yes, there are a ton, and deciphering which ones that I've written in my notes, if you've answered them. So here's a question. If government and journalists are responsible for combating disinformation, yet there's a lot of people distrust them, how could they take on this responsibility?
Well, so I'll look at it from every perspective. Like clearly, we have a lot of different players in our society who should be responsible. Government is held very responsible. Journalists are held responsible. But you know what? So are we. Like, what are we doing as PR practitioners to combat disinformation? And we have, I think, disinformation, misinformation, false information, being good consumers of information. It's one of, I don't know really many agencies or organization who are actually offering professional development programs relating to this. Like we decide, like, here's a gap, I need to train people to do X. But disinformation and misinformation is like a low investment. We don't invest, whether it's at the, the K through 12 level or at the college level or at our organization level, into training people, because it benefits us in the long run. So if you're a great consumer of misinformation, you're less likely to also spread it because you have a greater understanding. And it's kind of like you can educate people about it. I will say I taught in the mid 2000s, I taught at Cal Poly Pomona, and it wasn't in their comm school, but they did have like a media literacy minor. Dr. Jane Ballinger was very active in that. So there are some programs that teach people about not even just about being information literacy, but also like mass media effects and other sort of components.
There's another question. Would you consider conducting a study during the heat of the presidential election campaign?
Yeah, I mean, we'll do our one next year, and it will be during the campaign for sure. And there's going to be so many cases, what we're going to see and what we absolutely will see through the course of this election. And, it's all about people's perception. And I think Dave made that point earlier. It's what is the truth? What is your truth and your perception of truth? And based on the ridiculous amount of TikTok videos I watch, like people have some of the things that you hear people say are that it aligns with your value system. So when you hear it from other sources, especially when you hear it from sources you trust, it just sort of reiterates it. And I know Michael Chirinsen has talked about this before in some of his research, but there's also this concept of the backfire effect. And sometimes when you go out and you try to tell people that this information isn't true, and you're like, facts work, folks, facts don't necessarily, it's emotion and how you feel about it. But we have the backfire effect. And sometimes we go out and we say, we may make a case or why this is not true. And it actually reinforces people's opinions. So it's a challenge. And I feel like as an industry, we need to band together and really work hard to combat it.
Well, there's a case where a public health group near where I used to live, if you did not want to have your children vaccinated when they were born, the government would ask you to at least go to a training program. And they were trying to help people to understand the benefits of vaccination. And at the end of the day, and so it was an experiment to see if this would work. At the end of the day, everyone who went, no one changed their mind. And in fact, they were more entrenched against vaccines than before because they heard the pieces of information that they wanted to hear, and the facts didn't change them. So it backfired, exactly to Tina's point. And if anyone goes on any of the social media sites today and types in Hunter Biden walks out, and you'll see two completely diverging viewpoints on what happened and who was responsible and where it went to. And everyone is very confident in their viewpoint on this. Yet, depending on which Twitter path or X path you can go down the well of this was something where he owned the Republicans or he should be put in jail right now.
But I think the overall conclusion is it's also very exhausting for people. It's all exhausting for us, and it's going to just be. And I think I was listening to, I think Sarah, we were in LA in a car listening to or talking about the podcast. And when you ask people about, no one's really ready for the election because it is really stressful. And so when they ask people about how they felt about the election, they were like, because it's a lot and it's like constant stress and stuff. So.
All right.
Anything else? Should we wrap it up? Brittany, we'll turn it over to you.
think so. All right. Thank you both so much for leading this webinar today. And for everyone, as we've said, all of these resources, the whole chat, and separately, these resources will be shared with all of you within 48 hours. And let's see, if you have any other questions, IPR and Leger, we do consistently study disinformation and misinformation. So please just connect with us on social, and we're happy to continue that discussion. But thank you all again for joining us, and stay tuned for our next webinar in February. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Tina. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Brittany and Sarah, Anitra team.